Welcome back everyone to our studies in AQA A-Level History. This video is going to spend some time talking about society under the reign of Henry VIII. We will think about the division between the elites on the one hand and the commoners on the other, think about some of the regional issues as well as the social impact of religious upheaval. Of course, religious upheaval being one of the central characteristics, one of the central features of the reign of Henry VIII, his break from Rome, the king's grey matter, and the establishment of royal supremacy. And then we will finish by thinking about rebellion, specifically the Pilgrimage of the Grace, or Pilgrimage of Grace, should I say, the major event which shakes the later period of Henry's reign. And so beginning first then, we know already from our studies when we looked at Henry VII that society in England at this time was very, very hierarchical. You have the sort of top level of society followed by the next and the next and the next. And elites, of course, represented the peak, the highest part of the social structure. And at the top of the highest part of the social structure was the nobility. These included dukes, earls, and barons. Their wealth and their power was derived from vast estates that had been often granted personally to them by the monarch. Under the reign of Henry VIII, we see a shift in the nobility, with some losing land due to the dissolution of the monasteries, while some gaining wealth that is acquired by church lands. So specifically, the Tudor estate relied heavily on the nobility to administer local government and to enforce law and order. We know that just like as his father, Henry VIII was a little bit weary of the overpowerful nobles, particularly in the light of the Wars of the Roses and in the light of the kind of policies that his father had implemented as well. And we see, as a result of this, influencing some of his decisions. So, for example, use of attainders was something that was continued under the reign of Henry VIII. These were legal declarations that stripped nobles of land and their title. We also see the execution of a number of individuals. In 1510, for example, Empson and Dudley, the people who were part of the centre of Henry VII's council learned in terms of extracting revenue, they were both executed. So too was Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, in 1521. Henry also created new peers, but kept their numbers relatively small and kept their power mostly in check. In terms of the sort of seizing of religious institutions, we see in 1536 the first act of dissolution, and by the time of the second act of dissolution, many aristocrats were the beneficiaries of the dissolution of the monasteries. Thomas Cromwell was one such example who rose to prominence through his political acumen and acquired lots of monastic properties. We also see Thomas Wolsey benefit not necessarily from the dissolution acts, but mainly from his ability to essentially control royal finances with the creation of things like major courts and major houses and often quite a lot of land. In terms of the gentry class expanded for the most part during the reign of Henry VIII as well. As former monastic lands were sold off after the dissolution of the monasteries, many members of the gentry class would start to buy land, which would of course increase their influence and their wealth as well. We can see that many parts of the gentry played a very large role in local governance and served as JPs or justices of the peace. The clergy, then, if we think about the clergy, they were still also, obviously, very powerful figures within English society. The church was still an integral part, but after Henry's break from Rome and after the establishment of the Church of England, this significantly alters the relationship between the clergy and English society, and also significantly alters the church's power structure. We see, for example, the Archbishop of York, Thomas Wolsey, being an example of a prominent cleric who held political power. He fell from grace, of course, in 1529 due to his failure to secure Henry's divorce to Catherine of Aragon. More broadly, then, the common people of Tudor England were the peasants, the artisans, the merchants, and the labourers, who lived in stark contrast to that of the elite. The majority of the population lived in very rural areas, dependent often on agriculture, but also a growing urban population was starting to emerge, particularly in places like London. It was composed mainly of yeomen, husbandmen, artisans, and labourers. Although legally free, many of them lived close to subsistence levels, and so therefore were quite vulnerable to a number of economic shifts in things like crop yields and agricultural prices. We do see, however, that the population of this sort of common and social class begins to grow, approximately somewhere around 2 million in 1520, and increasing to as many as 3 million by 1547, increasing pressure on food supplies, land, and employment. Now, one of the issues that we start to see is the issue of enclosure, the fencing off of common lands. This had a negative effect on small farmers and contributed to rural poverty. And within this sort of social class then, it was the peasantry that made up the bulk of the population that would work on these lands, often as tenant farmers. While some peasants had relatively stable livelihoods, some were also subjected to quite harsh conditions, heavy taxation, and the issue of enclosure. The enclosure movement, then, was, during the reign of Henry VIII, something that led to many commoners losing their land and becoming wage labourers, or even having to shift towards urban centres. The result is creating a sense of urban social unrest, should I say, which is partially evidenced by the 1536 Pilgrimage of Grace, which was a rebellion that included peasants that were protesting the dissolution of the monasteries and the impact on enclosures. There were a number of reasons why the Pilgrimage of Grace takes place, and we'll get to that later on in a future slide. In terms of urbanization, then, the process of growing towns in England during this time, we do see a rise in urbanization. We do see towns like London growing at an increasing rate. The merchant class who had engaged in trade and commerce had gained wealth and influence, and this was the case despite the fact they were still beneath nobility in terms of social rank. And we can see that the Act of Resumption in 1515 attempted to recover Crown lands, leading to an increase in competition for land among merchant and gentry classes. We also see, during this time, that Henry instigates a number of naval reforms and the expansion of England's maritime capabilities, especially when it came to encouraging of trade with the Low Countries and Spain. We'll get to that in the next lesson, but that also contributes to a shift in employment towards these more urban environments, places like London and other areas where the towns are starting to grow. When we think about regional issues then in Tudor England, it should be noted that during the reign of Henry VIII, the state of England, the condition of England, as I say, not state as in like a state in terms of like a theory of a state, for example, or statehood. The idea, the condition of England during this time was that it was not a uniform society. There were regional differences, such as differences between North and South, and this did still play a major role in shaping society. And we'll also talk about Wales at a stage in this part as well. So in terms of north-south divides, in the north of England, it was more rural, it was often poorer, it was often less tightly controlled by the monarchy compared to areas of the south, which was more urbanised and wealthier. This regional divide then contributed to tensions, particularly in the context of religious divisions, which we'll get to in a second. When it comes to the north, like I said, they remained culturally distinct. And in the north, Catholicism was more deeply rooted and would often lead to the neglect of the central government in London. The Council of the North was used to try and assert authority, especially after a number of unrests. We'll see rebellions in a second. And ultimately, one of the central issues concerning the regions was, of course, religious divisions. Religion was a central factor for regional divide. So in the south, particularly London and the southeast, for example, they begin to accept the growing influence of the Reformation, the growing influence of Protestant ideas, whereas the north remained largely Catholic. In terms of Wales, we can see that there is an attempt during the reign of Henry VIII to integrate Wales more formally into the English legal system. This takes place in 1536 and in 1543 with the Laws in Wales Acts, which created an English-style county and gave Welsh individuals representation in Parliament, and also reduced the autonomy of local Welsh lords and brought the Welsh gentry into the English political sphere. In thinking about then sort of the social impact of religious upheaval, the most important of these issues was of course the dissolution of the monasteries. The dissolution of the monasteries took place between 1536 and 1541, and it was a central event which shifted the religious, social and economic fabric of England. Monasteries were not only religious centres of very important features, but they were also very important hubs for education, charity and local governance. So, under the advice of Thomas Cromwell, Henry dissolved over 800 monastic institutions. The result was major in terms of both social and economic, because the monasteries were not just areas where there was the practice of Catholic religion. Monasteries also provided education, they provided healthcare, it provided spiritual services, and often provided lots of areas of support for the poor. Their removal then, the removal of 800 monastic institutions, created a social vacuum. Over 8,000 monks and nuns would be displaced. Although monks received pensions, many others were left impoverished. The land was then sold to nobles and the gentry, which further contributed to a rise in social inequality and the redistribution of wealth to the Protestant-aligned elite. When we see the introduction of the English Bible, we see the removal of the images of saints, the suppression of traditional rituals, and this again causes a sense of cultural disorientation. Don't forget, this is taking place from 1536 to 1541. If you really want to, you could sort of push this even a little bit further into the reign of Edward VI, but it does not take place over a long period of time. There is a clear cultural backlash, especially then when we get into the reign of Mary, who then tries to reverse some of these reforms that were made under her dad and her brothers' reigns. In terms of rebellions, I've cited here the Western Rebellion because the Western Rebellion gives us indication of the kinds of social unrest that we start to see, even though the Western Rebellion takes place under the reign of Edward VI. So keep the Western Rebellion in mind because this takes place in 1549, but focus instead on the Pilgrimage of Grace. That's what I'll do in this lesson, and we'll talk about the Western Rebellion in a future lesson. So, the Pilgrimage of Grace was one of the largest, and it was one of the most significant rebellions during the reign of Henry VIII. It was, in fact, one of the most significant rebellions in Tudor history entirely. It was response to the dissolution of the monasteries, as well as Henry's break from Rome, as well as the imposition of new taxes. There were a few multifaceted causes to the Pilgrimage of Grace. The rebellion was led by an individual by the name of Robert Aske and involved a number of rebels from the north. It was ultimately the largest rebellion of Henry's reign. It involved between 30 and 40,000 people, primarily people who were located in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. The causes that I've just mentioned were religious changes, particularly the sort of cultural shock that came as the result of the dissolution of the monasteries. It took place the same year as the beginning of this dissolution process. It was also economic concerns, the enclosure movement, bad harvest and high taxes. And we also see the fear of centralisation, political centralisation, and the influence of Cromwell, who was viewed as a corrupt, low-born reformer. Ultimately, the rebellion was crushed, as you can probably imagine. The rebels did demand the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of Cromwell and the other evil councillors, and for a parliament to be established in the north. Now, at the time at which we see the Pilgrimage of Grace be crushed and the rebellion be ultimately dealt with by Henry, Henry promised a parliament in the north and promised pardons for those who rebelled against him, but then reneged on both of these offers. The rebellion was suppressed by force. Over 200 rebels were executed, including the leader, Robert Aske, and the aftermath saw an increasing crackdown in more quite brutal detail, especially in the strengthening of royal authority in the north. Ultimately, then, the Pilgrimage of Grace can be a useful illustration of the backlash to rebellious issues during the reign of Henry VIII, the backlash to religious issues specifically. The rebels had issued calls for a return to Catholic practices, including what was known as the 10 Articles. Ultimately, it didn't amount to anything, but shows clearly the social discontent that was caused as a result of both the break from Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries.